At the top of the program, we showed you President Trump ranting about Bob Mueller, and we attempted to separate fact from fiction. Now, what we're going to do is take a closer look at how two men can talk about the same thing but sound like they're from different planets. I'm talking about Mueller and the Attorney General William Barr. Let's start with the investigators who Barr is now investigating. Here is the point and counterpoint.
I want to thank the attorneys, the FBI agents, the analysts, the professional staff who helped us conduct this investigation in a fair and independent manner. These individuals, who spent nearly 2 years with the special counsel's office, were of the highest integrity.
I think spying did occur. Yes, I think spying did occur. Congress is usually very concerned about intelligence agencies and law enforcement agencies staying in their proper lane, and I want to make sure that happened.
Now take a listen to how Mueller and Barr discussed both collusion and obstruction.
There was no evidence of the Trump campaign collusion with the Russian government's hacking.
There was insufficient evidence to charge a broader conspiracy.
The Deputy Attorney General and I concluded that the evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
If we had had confidence that the president clearly did not commit a crime, we would have said so.
And just today, Barr commenting on how Mueller handled obstruction of justice. Take a listen.
I personally felt he could have reached a decision.
In your view, he could have reached a conclusion.
Right, he could have reached a conclusion. The opinion says you cannot indict a president while he's in office, but he could have reached a decision as to whether it was criminal activity.
Joining us now, former federal prosecutor Andrew Cherkasky. And Andrew, it is sometimes there's parsing of language, but I don't think you had to squint too hard to see daylight between the two of them. Very different ideas about what the report said and didn't say and how they got to that inevitable conclusion. It was, I think, pretty fascinating.
It's amazing how two people can look at the exact same thing, even as career prosecutors, even in the same department for as many years as they were together, and come up with a different conclusion. Mr. Barr coming out today to say that a conclusion could have been reached regarding criminal conduct. He was in charge of Mr. Mueller at the end of this report. I don't understand why he wouldn't have encouraged Mr. Mueller to reach that conclusion if that's what he truly believed. So I find some real issue with that conclusion of his today.
And moreover, I want to play another point, counterpoint, and this I thought really spoke to the crux of it, which is not just what the OLC in terms of guidelines says you can or can't do, but also the importance of it in this process, because Barr and Mueller have two very different outlooks on it. Let's take a listen.
Under long-standing department policy, a president cannot be charged with a federal crime while he is in office. That is unconstitutional. Even if the charge is kept under seal and hidden from public view, that too is prohibited.
He was not saying that but for the OLC opinion, he would have found a crime. He made it clear that he had not made the determination that there was a crime.
You know, first off, I want to get to the substance, but let's get to the form. Barr has repeatedly, including the day of the release, as we famously know, at 9:30 in the morning, he gives the interpretation and the summation, if you will, of the report that once you read it, you say, well, that's not my take of this, or at least most legal experts came to that same conclusion. Is that the role of the AG, especially in this relationship, to, in effect, explain for the public the words for Mueller? And do you think, in retrospect, Mueller made a mistake by letting Barr take that platform and having to clean up on aisle 6 many weeks later?
So this is definitely a case of lawyers being lawyers and how they parse through words and how they parse through definitions. I think that Attorney General Barr did something that is reasonable for a department head to do, and that's to boil down to a short piece of paper or short document the conclusions or the results of something that his department is doing. Now, at the end of the day, when you look at what his conclusions were and how he boiled that down and concluded it, is it consistent with what Mr. Mueller found in over 400 pages, or with what Mr. Mueller has said on occasion about his feelings of that? And it's absolutely not, because it isn't consistent, not in my view at least, because when you look at what Mr. Mueller found ultimately, it's not as simple as but for the OLC. Sure, he didn't say but for the OLC he would have prosecuted. He said he wasn't willing to make the recommendation because Mr. Trump didn't have an avenue to defend himself. I wonder if he still has that same opinion, with as much as Mr. Trump has done in Twitter to try to defend himself since the report was released.
But again, for just the consumption purpose of our audience, and tell me if I'm overstating this, you have Barr saying, oh, the OLC, it's a red herring. It's not really significant here. Not once, but twice yesterday, Mueller made a point. I was in a lane. Now, whether he chose to define the guardrails of that lane or they were more explicit and he followed them to a T, he said, I couldn't go there. But may be very clear. If we found that Trump had no wrongdoing, we would have said so. Implicit in that is they clearly found wrongdoing, but they couldn't indict a president. Those are two completely different takes on where the limitations were on Mueller at the beginning, during, and at the conclusion of this process.
So let's talk about what the OLC is really saying. It's saying you can't indict a president, and it goes through a long list of reasons for that, but ultimately it boils down to a separation of the powers between the branches of government. Indicting a president means the executive branch, because the DOJ is part of the executive branch. That would mean that one of the president's own departments is indicting him. So it's essentially like the coup that he's talking about, in that it's coming from within. It should be another branch of government if it's set up in that co-equal structure that we have. It should be the Congress who's doing that. Now, what I ultimately am asking the question of here is, why did it go so far if Mr. Mueller knew all along that he wasn't going to be able to indict, either for Russia or for obstruction? What were we doing for those 2+ years, letting that go on for as long as it did, if he was just going to say that it was Congress's responsibility to deal with any sort of findings that he had, and now the public is exhausted from such a lengthy investigation? It seems as though we've lost our patience because it took too long, and it should have been Congress in the first place, perhaps.
And obviously we saw indictments and convictions, but you can ask, if he was never going to go there, why did all those subpoenas were issued, and what happened to all that underlying evidence? But I want to get you to both translate and try and get in the head of Mueller as to why he did what he did when he said, in part, that if they found that Trump did not commit a crime, he would have said so, and they did not. Translate that to the layperson, and also, why did he feel it was important? Was it a message to Congress? Why did he feel it was important to say, hey, we believe the president committed a crime. It wasn't our place, though, to do something about it?
So in simple terms, when a prosecutor sits at their desk, cases come in with an investigative report. You take a look at it and you make a distinction between the cases that you believe reasonably could result in a conviction or those cases that just don't have enough evidence. And in those cases, you do a non-prosecution. You don't find that the person is innocent or that the crime didn't take place. You're simply reaching the conclusion that there wasn't enough evidence. Now, this report, and Mr. Mueller goes a step further, especially with Russia, in finding that there's not evidence of certain things. Not that there's not enough evidence to convict, but that there's actually not evidence of it. When we get to the obstruction side of things, he distinguishes it, and he says that he hasn't made that same conclusion. And oh, by the way, I'm not going to use language that would be equivalent of an indictment because Mr. Trump can't defend himself. So when you really boil it down, what you're seeing is Mr. Mueller is just kind of stating the facts. This is what I found, and this is the most that I can do with it. I don't ascribe necessarily to the idea that Mr. Mueller is calling on Congress to impeach. I think at most he's saying that if something were to happen, it's Congress's responsibility to take that on.
Andrew, it certainly is going to be an interesting aftermath. I have no idea what the next day, let alone week, is going to bring us, but I appreciate your time tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
All right, everybody, when we come back, as the Trump turns, another day, another batch of stories, too weird to believe, but it is our president. We're going to show you what we're talking about right after this quick commercial break.